Perfect, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here. It's been a long time since I last spoke at BSides Toronto. Last time was 6 years ago. And, and I believe kind of that it points to more or less to the type of session that I like to bring to these types of events, right? Last time I was here, it was live, by the way, when those previous times where you used to see people kind of in real world. But I was speaking about behavioral economics and their influence in security at that time. And that's the kind of interest that I always have about these adjacent scientific sides and how they would normally affect the security world. And that's something similar to what I'm bringing here today, right? So what I'm looking at now is how the language that we use in the security realm affects kind of how we perform from a security, delivering security, right? So that's kind of what I want to explore a bit more today, and I hope kind of it will bring some action items, some insights, or things that will help you make kind of security better based on this assessment or this this view of the language that we use in our world, right? And when I talk about language, we are essentially looking at the practice of communication, right? Because that process where we try to exchange information using a common, and I think that a common is a word that is quite important here, a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. And it won't take much time for me to show that in our realm, right, kind of in our field, we suck at it. And if I wanted to do kind of an entire fail panel style session of talking how bad we screw things up with bad communication in security, I could do that. I could spend probably kind of an entire afternoon bringing example after example. Right? So I think kind of I'm gonna show a few for those that may not believe, right, that's a problem that exists in our area, but it really kind of something that we have to improve. So looking a bit more into communication and security, right? Security by itself requires intense cooperation between the parties so we can actually do it, right? It's just not achievable when you cannot agree in certain key concepts and how it represents the things that we are dealing with and kind of what type of standards you use for that. Imagine someone will go and look into an application, for example, and that you're responsible for security, and they go back and say, you know, there's some funny things there, right? But they may be bad, right? And 2 hours later, your website is completely compromised, right? And they said, well, I told you, but you never told me there was a big vulnerability. No, I said there was something bad there, right? And it could be an issue. There is a vulnerability here. Vulnerability is a well understood concept. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. How serious was that? That could use something like CVSS, for example, to represent the measure of severity in a better manner as well, right? So you see how the communication can improve when we can use the language in a more precise manner. Now, many times when you bring these types of concerns about communicating better, etc., for those that are really kind of in the weeds into things like researching or developing new types of exploitation, etc., it may look like a smaller problem to deal with. But I like to point to probably kind of one of the most famous cases of using bad communication or bad standards and bad language from one side to the other in a more technical and probably more scientific environment, right? So kind of how much of a big deal it can be. And this is kind of the case of the Mars Climate Orbiter. It was one of these probes, right, that we've been sent into Mars about 20 years ago or so. And it was built, right, kind of with those kind of millions of dollars in investment. It was launched successfully. It spent a few months, right, kind of moving kind of from Earth to Mars. When it was about to get in orbit, where it would start to do its job, that process of kind of getting into orbit just failed spectacularly, and the probe was lost forever. So there was a lot of work on kind of trying to understand exactly what happened, the lessons learned, kind of looking for a root cause. Yes, there was a root cause. Essentially, there was a mismatch in the units that were used to represent certain quantities, right? So kind of the how much trust the engine would produce, right? So there were two ways of measuring that, right? Those American standards, right, that they kind of only America uses, like kind of pound force things, and then there was the international metric system that was kind of in Newton seconds, right? And there was a difference in those measures, in those units, by a factor of 4.45. So essentially, you're telling, oh, put 10 Newton seconds there, and the software was interpreting as put 10 pound/seconds. So that was, of course, right, a pretty different quantity from one side to the other, and the probe just went to somewhere else, right, and it crashed miserably in Mars. So this is a typical, right, and simple example of how you're trying to communicate a quantity and you fail in using a common language, and you just destroy and you throw in the garbage millions of dollars kind of research projects and a lot of other things, right, and opportunity cost and so on. So I think keep in mind that communicating badly can generate a result like what happened with the Mars Climate Orbiter. But even then, right, if we understand that these things can happen, you may still argue that, well, it's not really something that happened in our field, in security. And here I'll bring kind of my personal opinion. I'll say I believe it is also a big issue in our world. And I observed over time many cases where that thing was really kind of causing issues into how things are being performed in the security world. And there are multiple levels for this discussion. I will divide the problem later into some key concepts, buzzwords, knowledge representation. There are different levels where you can look at this problem, but I think a classic concepts around risk is really kind of a very good example to see here, right? And Alex Hutton likes to use the example about kind of trying to multiply some quantities that are not necessarily something that you can multiply, right? So like ordinary numbers and trying to multiply them. And he uses an example that sometimes what we do in those crazy risk calculations for someone out of our field that has probably kind of stronger mathematical skill set, it sounds like peanut butter times jet engine equals shiny, right? Equals shiny. It is something that is completely nonsense, but it's sometimes what we are seeing in these reports, in this risk assessment, some things that are just not multipliable being added, being multiplied and generating some numbers that actually do not mean anything, right? But looking at all those things, we still think, and we expand them. Let's expand and see if there are other problems. Can you tell me for sure, and can you bet money in saying that everyone that is watching this session right now will define threat hunting in the same manner? I can bet money that no, we're going to see different definitions or different interpretations of what that means. But if it is something important that the organizations should be doing, how can we work towards that end if they cannot agree into what we are trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, right? So that's one of the only examples. Do you have a red team, right? What is a red team, right? We can even go further and talk about blue team, purple team, and whatever color you want to have a team, is still, we're gonna have different interpretations of all those things. What about X freaking DR, right? Well, still, I am a vendor and we have an XDR product, and I believe that lots of people out there will not understand that what I'm selling is an XDR solution because their definition of XDR is different than mine. And that's pretty bad, right? So do you still think we don't have a problem here? Yes, we do, and we need to try to make it better. Let's try to get a better view of this problem and see kind of what it looks like and where, right, what are those layers that I mentioned where we're going to find this issue. And I want to look first at the key concepts, right? Nothing important, right? Just like telling someone what is an asset, what is a vulnerability, what is a threat, risk, the triad, right? The confidentiality, integrity, availability. The list of key concepts goes on, and kind of it's pretty big. It may seem like, okay, people will just tell kind of that a vulnerability. Sometimes we'll mistake vulnerability for threat, etc. Right? It may look as something that is not that much of a problem, but I remember I used to work for Gartner, and in Gartner, one of the things that you do very frequently is taking calls, right, from Gartner clients, and they have a challenge in their hands, and they are calling you for advice, right? So I would spend an hour with the client discussing a certain problem. And there was one customer one Gartner client that I remember that they were reviewing or they were building an RFP or a request for vendors to submit proposals for a pen testing exercise, right? And when they're saying, they're describing what they wanted to see as the result of that exercise, they were asking that the vendor will identify any threats, vulnerabilities, and breaches in their environment. What the heck, right? Have you ever seen a penetration test that can identify breaches? I never seen one, right? And what happened when I started having that conversation with that customer, I realized that for them, any word that has some kind of negative connotation in this within this concept, for them was the same thing, was something when it was, I would say probably on their minds was the vulnerability, right, on a weakness that was to be identified as part of that exercise and then fixed right after they would see that in the report. So for them, vulnerability, threats, and breaches were the same thing. That's pretty bad, right? And you see that when the vendor will receive the type of description, what should be delivered, right? The vendor may not understand that it was just a bad case of communication, or miscommunication, and add to their proposal compromise assessment because they had to find breaches anyway, right? So you end up giving a proposal, right? A statement of work that will be very different from the expectation of the customer on that case, right? So you see how much of a problem it can become. You're gonna see, for example, cases where you are trying to accomplish a threat assessment. I want to understand which threats I'm exposed to and how bad they are. And someone will give you a vulnerability assessment. Will find weaknesses, right, and in your environment that threat could exploit to cause you harm. They see there are different things. So the way that you use in a different way, slightly different way, these key concepts will cause miscommunication, and it also can cause a misalignment of expectations and really ruin up everything. It starts with a very small problem, right, of understanding key concepts, but it can really escalate in a way that you end up with these different expectations of what's going on here. Now, key concepts is a problem that you say it's big enough, right? But there are other tricky words and terms that make things even harder from a communication standpoint for security, right? Think about what exactly is an attack, right? And now that we're seeing more things in the news about the ransomware cases, oh, there was a cyber attack. Okay, some people just laugh, right? Okay, there was a a commodity malware, right, that does extortion, right, ransomware, and they're calling that a cyber attack. For me, cyber attack involves people doing something in a more proactive manner. Well, for me, maybe, but someone else may have a different interpretation of what a cyber attack is. When you start going into more contentious spaces, like what is a hack, right? Oh, there was a hack. Some people get really bothered about that negative connotation that hacking will sometimes carry on, right? Sometimes we're going to have that more pure understanding. Now, hacking is not only breaching into systems in a non-authorized manner. There are many other things that can be considered as hacking that doesn't have the negative perspective, right? So you see how misaligned we have. And if it's a problem on the key concepts, when we start expanding to this space where we have breach, threat hunting, red team, cyber something, what is cyber anyway, right? We're going to see that the misalignment starts to grow substantially. Now, that's where we get into a point in where the vendors, and I include even the space where I am, right? I am a security vendor. I sell security analytics or SIM or XDR or whatever. What am I selling, right? We can look at the buzzword bingo to see how exactly we describe these solutions. This is actually a buzzword bingo that was created by someone to carry on the export for an RSA. Right? There are many people that do that by joke. Just the number of buzzwords that are created in this space is so crazy, right? That we can play buzzword bingo, right? You can print something like this and go on the floor. You're gonna see the vendors use the most crazy buzzwords to try to describe what they offer, describe what they're fighting against, and so on. If it was only a thing about vendors, but threat researchers, right, and kind of people that are identifying certain vulnerabilities, they have their part of guilt as well, right? Look at these logos here. We are looking at all those vulnerabilities that become so fancy that they have a logo as well, right? Not only they have a fancy name and they have a logo like Heartbleed, Shell Shock, right? Kind of all these things, right? Kind of why do we need that? Right? Kind of why we need to create this additional level of confusion about these vulnerabilities? Not to look into kind of the technologies as they come up, right? Kind of the hype around certain ideas end up kind of pushing forward the vendors, the industry analysts to create new acronyms, right? I was mentioning XDR before, right? But there is a new one now about something that does kind of the attack surface kind of analysis and management. I think it's CAASM or CASM. Kind of the number of acronyms that we create in this industry is just crazy, right? And who is guilty, right, kind of for all these things, right? The vendors and their marketing side, they need to find a way to differentiate, and sometimes it's by trying to represent themselves as playing a green field that only them kind of is that will be able to do that, right? So instead of saying I am another SIM vendor and there are other SIM vendors that compete with me, I'm gonna tell you I'm not a SIM. I'm not competing with all these guys. I have an fully integrated security analytics and operations platform. Well, that's great. That sounds amazing, right? And now there's no one like me, so I'm the only one in this field. So that's kind of some approach that some vendors will try to do to try to avoid competing with some other with other vendors, right? When they see that they won't be able to compete in a fair manner or in a manner that will give them some chance. Security researchers, as I mentioned, trying to get notice, getting more visibility to the vulnerabilities that they are finding, techniques that they are finding. And the industry analysts sometimes kind of they have different views if they want to create that acronym, because then it becomes really something like, oh, Gartner has CARTA, right? It's a view that is more complex and more complete than Zero Trust that came from Forrester. So you see that even the industry analysts, and I've seen that and I saw that from inside, right? They end up competing for certain definitions, and sometimes they end up going overboard and creating some definitions that were maybe not necessary to try to get some privileged position where they are the ones that are telling exactly what that is, why that concept is important, and so on. Now, kind of trying to get out of some of these probably kind of more human language challenges. Because we also have challenges when we try to represent knowledge in this field. And in many ways, we're talking about knowledge that will even be produced and consumed by machines, right? And that's kind of where sometimes we have data format standards and other things that kind of also come as a challenge for the language of security. Think about security events, right? Okay, I want to send an event for technology A, like an IDS, to a SIM. What is the standard I should use to tell the SIM exactly what this event is about? Surprisingly, we do not have good standards for that. And that's why the SIMs, and I'm kind of here kind of putting kind of my vendor hat for a moment, that's why our job is so challenging. Because something that will be described as an authentication event by one vendor will be called an access control event by another. They will be described, there's not, I'll say, unified code that will define that events, although it's coming from different technologies, is the same. So all their work in normalizing that information goes to the SIM. Same thing is going to go for incidents, for threat intelligence, for vulnerabilities. And there was a comment when there was an assessment of Mitre JSON program kind of many years ago. They were saying that security community need a common language and a set of basic concepts. See, I'm highlighting these things here that will allow them to develop and share the common understanding and operate in a more scientific manner. That's something that they also said at that time. Right. So if we look into some of these kind of knowledge representation problems, I like to look at the threat intelligence side, right? The threat actor naming. So, okay, I identified that a certain threat has a certain threat actor operating, right, kind of behind it. And we're going to see that the different vendors that are doing all this threat research use their own schemas, right? CrowdStrike and their bears, Mandiant and their APT certain number, right? Kaspersky and some monsters. That's very cool, right? But that doesn't help us in making sure that when you are talking about a certain threat actor, that threat actor is the same that I am referring to, right? Why can't we just use the binomial naming system that the biology uses, right? Okay, those species number are normally going to use in Latin. it's harder than it seems, right? First, especially when we look at the threat intelligence side, there are questions about, are we really seeing the same thing? Is it really the same threat actor? They're going to use shared infrastructure, shared tool sets, and not to talk about all the group dynamics that sometimes people that are part of a group will split and create a new one, right? Or there will be a merger, right, of two threat actor groups. Sometimes they will rebrand themselves. So all that makes the challenge of arriving at a standard or a common language something that is not that easy, right? So you see here that although it may look like an over effect of marketing from the security vendors, no, it's not an easy challenge. So there really there really are kind of additional challenges that prevent us from getting an easy solution to have a simple standard or a simple naming convention for threat actors. Okay, we have a problem, right? But how do we fix it? I think that many times when you look at these types of challenges, we end with kind of a problem contemplation part, right? When we develop presentations in an organization like Gartner, right? We're normally strongly incentivized by our managers, right, to avoid problem contemplation. All this is very interesting, but what are you going to do about it, right? What are you going to tell people about how to address this problem? And when you look at these things that are not necessarily a domain-specific problem, right? Language issues, right, or getting the right standards, not appropriate communication is something that affects many fields. So what are the others doing about it? How do they fix it, right? I think first, for things where we have quantities that are being measured, math helps a lot, right? And especially when you're looking at the risk domain, I think there are lots of things that we can do just using math principles that will really help in reducing that confusion, reducing the level of misunderstanding of concepts. So really, we have to rely on math when math is really applicable. Another page that we can take from other fields is the engineering drawing principles. And when you're trying to understand something like a system that is very complex, you can describe that in drawing. And engineering has really advanced into what a blueprint should look like. The list of parts, exploding the views in a way that you can see how the parts are assembled together. And I think on this case, we've been doing probably decent job when you look at some of the older things, like the network diagrams, where we even have some common understanding of what certain icons are, right? These stencils on Visio. Now, when we move to the cloud, we may be losing some of that common standardization. I can see some people using the logos from the different AWS products, for example, for Lambda, for S3, for EC2, and that also helps in the same manner, but we need to be careful to not lose that small level of standardization that we are able to achieve when we move to this new realm of technology where we need to have different pictures and different ways to represent things. Biology, as I mentioned before, right, they have the binomial naming system, right, where they have something that defines the genus of the creature, right, of that living form, and something that will be more specific. Apis mellifera, right, the honeybee, right? Apis it's on the bees, right, and then mellifera, the one that produces honey. There is this interesting one, right, Spongiforma squaripensi, right? That's it's the scientific name of a fungus, right, a sponge, essentially, right? And you can clearly see what is referring to. So when you look here, the answer seems to be standards and conventions, right? We can do that too, right? Yes, we can. And let's try to see how we do it. And I think probably where we got a better result here is with the basic concepts. Remember, what is a vulnerability? What is a threat? What is risk? And we already have plenty of standards that address that problem, right? And I have some of my recommendations here. From a worldwide perspective, there's the ISO 27000 family. If you look at NIST produced 812, 830. In fact, within the 800 family, there are many very good standards that can be used to standardize language. RFC 2119 also help you with things like should, must, shall, when, how you interpret those more conditional terms. If you're writing a security policy, you know that that's a big deal, right? If you say that something should be done, what does that mean to the reader, right? Should they? What if they do not do, right? If they do not follow the requirement, what happens to them? Right? So that's something that you can clearly describe what those terms mean from the practical standpoint of the reader, and really eliminate a lot of confusion. There are also certification bodies that can help here. And as much as we like to complain or to make fun of certain credentials like the CISSP, they can help a lot on this case, basic concept. If these exams can put a heavier weight in how people manage, or how much they grasp on basic concepts, we can really reduce a lot of the confusion on this area. Would I only hire CISSPs? No. I mean, there are many people that are just brilliant that never went to the bother of getting their certifications. But I know that people that went to getting their CISSP, they had at least to read about these concepts, because there is a substantial part of the exam that will cover them. They may not have retained much, right? They may have done horribly in the concepts part, and just they managed to answer right all the things about the right fire extinguisher for each type of fire, right? Yes, I have my criticisms about how the weight of certain things work within the CISSP exam, but it's something that I know that if people had gone through studying for that credential, they may have been more exposed to the right or the more appropriate definitions for certain key concepts. Now, when we say all these things, it may look like the only thing that we need to do here is just create new standards, right? Let's standardize everything and we're good. And when we say that, I like to bring up the IDMF case, right? IDMF was a standard created to define exactly the message that will come out of something like an IDS, right? So you know exactly all the fields that you should have in a message that is describing an attack, right? It was detected. This is great, right? After all, I mentioned already, the logs are a nightmare, right? The formats, what message means, right? So they try to develop a log standard, especially for security solutions. They even became an RFC, right? 4765 is essentially the IDMF format. You see the screenshot from the RFC here defining all the fields. There are some very good definitions about how timestamps should look like. Timestamps are a nightmare until these days. About, okay, trying to identify something as a real timestamp and which format is using, and then interpreting that appropriately. It's a nightmare to these days, especially for platforms like SIM that are ingesting data from multiple sources. And IDMF was created in a very detailed way, right? So it looks like a great standard, but for one small problem. No one uses it, right? If you find something that has recently implemented IDMF, I will really be interested to see it, because it's something that no one does, right? And here is where we go into that discussion about real standards and de facto standards, right? De facto standards are those that are not pushed as something that is required or by a body like the ISO or NIST, but everyone starts using it just because it looks like a good common language, it fits their needs, right? So it ends up being adopted by the industry in general. And I can point even to the Ceph format that was popularized by ArcSight, right, many years ago. So today, when you look at many security technologies, they have the option to generate their events in Ceph. But even ArcSight these days is not a relevant solution anymore. It's still there, but almost no one buys it. But why would someone go to the effort of being able to ingest Ceph or generate Ceph? Because now it became very close to a de facto standard. If you want to write a log in a way that you know that someone else will be able to consume, you can do in Ceph. If you have a solution that you want to consume logs from multiple places, it also makes a lot of sense to accept the Ceph standard, because there are many sources of data that will use that standard. So de facto standards can really help here. And in many cases, they end up being a better solution than going the full discussion and death by committee path that standards like the IDMF kind of end up following. And it's not only Ceph. I like to bring some other success stories that we have in this field about trying to standardize our language or our knowledge representation. One that we've been using for some time, right? Verizon's DBIR report, that is probably one of the gold standards of sharing information about incidents, right? It uses a standard, a taxonomy called VERIS, and kind of it really describes to you how incident information should be structured. There is FAIR for risk, right? It is a factor analysis for risk, so you break risks in multiple components. It's also becoming a quite popular de facto standard. Mitre Attack, right? I love Mitre Attack because it's really kind of been fastly introduced as the standard way to describe threats activity. So many people may jump and just say, well, but it's not fully kind of encompassed, and there are things that may happen in your environment that are not described in the Mitre Attack framework, right? Yes, but it is a framework that kind of is being managed in a way that is quickly adapting to those needs. That's one thing, right? It's not something that, oh, we have a 5-year cycle of committee-based discussions about what's going to get into the next version, and then by the time that they hit the next iteration, someone is using something else, right? So it's not something that will die by committee, right? And we have version 10 that was recently released, right? Is getting kind of more techniques, more sub-techniques, additional data structures for the data sources that you can use to detect these techniques. It is really kind of an amazing standard, and kind of that is being used kind of by the threat intelligence, by threat detection and response, so we can have a common language to describe threat activity, right? And even if you do not, there's something that a technique that is not there, right? You can use the concepts of the Mitre Attack framework to describe those techniques. So even if it's not bringing you that technique specifically, describing, aligning it to tactics, describing the techniques, what are the data sources, how it's performed, which platforms are affected. There are many things that you can use based on the concepts from the Mitre Attack framework that can really help. Sticks is probably kind of a case where a more formal standard became a success. I think that probably kind of a certain time, there was a risk of OpenIOC that started being used by Mendia to become the de facto standard, but I think Sticks catch up, and I think that they avoided the over standardization and over process around Sticks in a way that kind of it became a good standard for us to use as well. Now, the risk discussion is something so important that I like to make a special note about it. The conversation around risk goes beyond making sure that you're using the right definitions, right? There are also many questions around how you properly represent the quantities, right? Quantities like likelihood and impact, and there are lots of math and statistics concepts that are related to it as well. I use the Hutton example, right, of peanut butter times engine equals shiny, right? Kind of, I think kind of that's something that we see very often in terms of quantities that shouldn't be mixed together, being kind of put in a mathematical quote unquote equation. So it's not something that is entirely about language. Normally, there are two problems related here: how you measure risk and how you analyze risk, and also a problem about definitions. So I think we normally have pretty bad examples on the risk management, risk assessment word, because we have these two problems interlaced in a very deep manner, right? So what should you do about it for risk? The first thing that I will tell everyone is do not reinvent the wheel. Just not think, oh, I'm gonna simplify. All the standards out there are too complex, so I'm gonna do my own scale for likelihood, my own scale for impact, and I'm gonna do this math here that will give a pretty good measure of risk. You probably did something stupid from the mathematical point of view, even if you're not aware of it, right? It's pretty hard to do it in a way that it is sound from a statistical and mathematical perspective. So try to not reinvent the wheel. It's very similar to crypto, right? No one creates their own crypto standards just because it's very hard to do it well. And I'll say try to avoid that for risk in the same way. use a reputable taxonomy, right? Kind of to what describes the components of risk. And I'll point to FAIR here. FAIR is your friend, is kind of one of those things that are becoming de facto standards. And if you want to get in the details from the math perspective, the statistical perspective, how to do it properly, take a look at Doug Hubbard's book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. I'd say today is maybe kind of the Bible that we have for this type of discussion. For all the other things that we have, right, there's something that journalists do a lot, right? They use style guides. How do we know that? What do journalists do when they need to mention certain things? That we may use different words, right, to describe, right, or different conventions about how to write about something. They rely a lot on style books, style guides, manuals of style. There are some very famous ones, like the Associated Press style book. We can use those as well from a general language point of view, right? Kind of how to write in a way that you're following conventions, kind of people can clearly understand what you're saying. But there are some resources that we have that are more specific to information security as well. Some time ago, there was kind of some pretty good work from Bishop Fox. I actually kind of have a typo there, I just realized, where they created a cybersecurity style guide. So there are the right way to write a certain concept, kind of where you need to capitalize, kind of there are certain words separate or together, but also kind of the description of what those concepts are, so you know that you're actually using it in the proper manner. There's also a book called The Language of Cybersecurity, compiled and edited by Maria Antonieta Flores, and she also does a pretty good job into helping us knowing that we are using the terms in the proper manner. So this is for us humans writing, right? When we talk about machines, there is another level of this discussion that is about the use of ontologies. Ontologies in this, or on the computer science world, is about setting categories, concepts, or the framework of kind of the specific area or domain. Like ours, we have here an example of an ontology for incident management, right? What is an incident, right? What are the response activities that you have, right? What are the roles of people in the? So there are lots of things that we need to define in these realms, and ontologies are a formal manner for you to do that. And ontologies end up being very useful because it helps you connect different technologies because they're interpreting things in the same manner, right? Think, for example, sometimes how a SIM would try to correlate things into a certain in a higher priority or in a higher level case, like Curator kind of calls it offenses, right? While, for example, within Securonic, we may call that an incident, and we use a threat model for that. We use different terms, and again, right? Kind of, can I exchange a Curator offense by kind of an incident within Securonics? Maybe not, because you may not be referring to exactly the same things. So I think kind of the use and the adoption of ontologies in our technologies will really enable the next level of security technology integration. Gartner has been talking about something that they call the security mesh, right? If you want to get to that level, we need to see the adoption of certain ontologies in a more formal manner. The only thing that we need to be careful on ontologies is that they don't follow IDMF in the way of the dodo in a way that is so complex that no one will use it. I had a call with a vendor, a technology vendor, when I was at Gartner, and it was funny that everything about behind their idea of product was around an ontology, but they spent an hour talking about the ontology and never about what the product were actually able to do or what problem they are trying to solve. So we just kind of gave up on listening from that vendor, because I think they're probably kind of with too much on the investing too much on the challenge of the communication and describing things properly and not solving any real problem. So where do we go from here? Say first thing you can do is pay attention to your language. Change starts with us. Keep it simple. Don't exaggerate and kind of try to build too much flourish along your language. And second, right, put together a glossary or a style guide for your employer, right? It doesn't have to be very complex, but even sometimes there is one, so use the one that exists, right? If you're involved in regulatory bodies, try to avoid the EDMF fate by streamlining the creation of these standards. If you're in marketing for a technology vendor, please just shut up do not create terms that do not make any sense, and I promise I'll try it too. And support any kind of good standard initiatives that are becoming de facto standards. Let's talk about Sigma. Let's talk about all these kind of FAIR, right? And all these other cases. I think kind of we should support them because they are good initiatives and they're helping the community. I am getting over time, but I want to throw in here a bonus recommendation, but I know that we have another session by the end of the day that will talk about exactly about this. It is working to get rid and abandon exclusionary language and things that end up being creating microaggression to certain kind of to many people that are that we try to be, we're being more inclusive and bring to this field as well, right? So let's replace a few terms that we've been using for a long time and that may carry some kind of negative connotation for certain populations, so kind of they can feel more welcome in our community as well. Words have power, please remember that. So many references to go in detail. I hope I can share the deck after. I can talk about the references in Discord later if you want, but thank you for listening. I am 1 minute over time. Not sure, Suravi, if we have time for questions, or I can just jump in Discord and try to help them there.
Hi, Augusto. Thank you so much for the slides. It was a great presentation, and we have a lot of discussions going on in